thank my colleagues across the aisle, Ms. Waters, Mr. Richmond, for their support. I do want to clarify one thing, because I think that the statement was made that it's not an unintended consequence for premiums to go up and go down, and that is true. But the unintended consequence that we're speaking about is the consequence that many of those that have lived in these areas for 40 or 50 years are suddenly going to lose their homes because of extreme rise in premiums, upwards of $15,000 and more. So that's the unintended consequence. I just wanted to make sure that that was clear. I know this not because I myself live on the coast in a flood area, but because Superstorm Sandy left a trail of utter destruction in New York City, particularly in Staten Island and parts of Brooklyn, a destruction that was absolutely unprecedented in the city's history. Tens of thousands of my constituents found themselves homeless. Their lives were turned upside down, and they're wondering how they're ever going to rebuild or ever move forward. Quite simply, many of my constituents lost everything to Superstorm Sandy, and it will be years before their lives return to any sense of what I would consider normal. So to ask these victims of a natural disaster who find themselves in this horrible position through no fault of their own to pay upwards of $15,000 a year in a flood insurance premium so soon after this disaster took everything from them amounts to nothing more than them being victimized yet again. So if these premiums were to go into effect, the reality is simple. For many of my constituents, they're going to find themselves unable to pay both their mortgage and their flood premiums. And their property, in best case scenario, best case, will lose considerable value. But in the worst case, it will become completely worthless. This, to me, is unacceptable. And this is why I support delaying the implementation of Section 207 of the Biggert-Waters Act, so that Congress will have the time to re-examine and look at these rate increases and consider ways to ensure that the future viability of the flood insurance program, while at the same time ensuring that flood insurance remains affordable to those that need it most. So I ask my colleagues to consider all that these individuals have been through, all that they have lost, and bring some understanding to the unintended consequence of not only losing everything they've ever owned, but now because of flood premiums, possibly losing the entire value of their home. So I ask for their support on this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I yield my time to Ranking Member Maxine Waters.
The gentleman from Florida has to remain on his feet.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank Mr. Grimm for his eloquent description of precisely what can happen and what is happening, and his plea to all of us to ensure that we don't place people in the position of losing their homes because they cannot afford these extraordinary increases in premiums. I met with residents from Plaquemine Parish who came to the Congress of the United States. All the elected officials and community leaders came together, and they came here to make a plea to us to understand that with this increase in premiums, they certainly can't afford it, and they can't afford to sell it because nobody's going to buy it. And so Mr. Grimm talked about victimization and the fact that we would be victimizing people who are victims of natural disasters twice. And that's precisely what it's all about. And I think that we are more caring than that. I think that we understand that there's still a lot of things to be worked out. The flood maps have not been completed. The pricing has not been really dealt with, and so I think we need time. We need time in order to answer these questions, to deal with the complexities of what we're trying to do. I think we can stabilize flood insurance. I think that is possible, but I, as one of the authors of this bill, I'm also making a plea to say that we did everything that we could to try and have a bill that's sustainable, that's viable, that makes good sense, but as we review what is going on and the risk and the harm that people are now confronted with, we're saying let's take a step backwards for a short period of time and let's give these victims and other victims in other areas of this country an opportunity to at least hold on to their homes and not have them literally taken away from them because we didn't realize these unintended consequences. And I will yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. I yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. For what purpose the gentleman from Louisiana rise?
To strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I rise in strong support of Congressman Cassidy's amendment and want to touch on a few things. And first of all, when we talk about the need for reform to the National Flood Insurance Program, there were many things that needed reform. In fact, the program had expired, lapsed, in some cases for a few hours, for a few days, multiple times over the last few years. And that's not a consistency that I don't think any of us want to see in our economy, when it literally meant home sales would have to be canceled. Realtors that were preparing to have a house sold, somebody that was buying a house, selling a house, couldn't even do that because banks require, in many cases, that flood insurance be attached to the mortgage. And if there was no program for flood insurance, then that means somebody couldn't even buy or sell a house. So it had an incredible disruption in our economy. But there's also the importance of making sure that the program's sustainable. When you look at what is flawed in the interpretation of FEMA, as we stand right now, a year after passage of the law, FEMA has admitted themselves they're not ready to implement the changes in the law. And we go through communities, and I want to mention a few in particular because it highlights the problems that have maybe been misrepresented, maybe are just not even understood by some people when they wonder about this program. There are communities, and I'll use some examples of some communities in my district in coastal Louisiana. Houma Terrebonne, for example. The Houma Terrebonne flood protection system was a system that was built by the people in those communities. It wasn't a Corps of Engineers project. That community did not flood in Hurricane Katrina, did not flood in Hurricane Rita, didn't flood in Hurricane Isaac. And yet, if you look at what FEMA has done with a community like that, they don't even recognize that that flood protection system exists. They've decertified that levee. And so everybody in that community who never flooded, they never filed a claim. There's this perception out there that these are people who have flooded multiple times. These people in this community never flooded, even during Katrina, Rita, Isaac. And yet FEMA has decertified their levee and said basically they don't have a levee. So somebody who's behind a levee protection system that worked for Katrina, FEMA has said that levee system doesn't exist, and that person now is being faced with currently maybe a $500 premium that FEMA is telling them is going to go up to $15,000 a year. Now, does anybody really think that a family making maybe $40,000 who has a home that never flooded, they never filed a claim, and now FEMA is going to tell them you have to pay $15,000 a year just for your flood insurance? Well, I think one of the reasons CBO said there's no score on this is because they recognize that person can't pay that $15,000 premium. You've literally made that home worthless, a home that never flooded, that's behind a flood protection system. And the irony is, let's look at the Corps of Engineers certified flood system. Go look at New Orleans. The New Orleans flood protection system that failed during Katrina, flooded thousands of households, caused tremendous devastation and loss of life. That's a certified levee. That system that failed is certified, and then the Houma Terrebonne system that never failed, that never flooded, is decertified by FEMA. You're going to tell those people they have to pay $15,000, $20,000 a year for flood insurance when they never flooded, and their system works. Same thing with La Rose to Golden Meadow hurricane protection system. FEMA, under their interpretation of this law, is saying that levee doesn't even exist. Let me show you a picture. This is during a storm recently. You can see the floodwaters here. And yet behind that levee system, the La Rose to Golden Meadow hurricane protection system, these people didn't flood. All you see is green grass here. There's no water because they didn't flood. FEMA has said this flood protection system doesn't exist. So these people who never flooded, who haven't filed a claim, they're not a burden to the system. They're paying premiums to the system right now, actually helping try to get it back into the black. FEMA's saying this levee system doesn't even exist, so now these people will have to pay maybe $20,000 a year in flood insurance. Well, again, They can't pay $20,000 a year in flood insurance. Nobody that's not a millionaire can do that. And so they'll walk away from that home. The bank will have to absorb that mortgage. And so their homes are basically going to be deemed worthless, even though their flood protection system works today. They never flooded. By the way, this one, same like home at Terrebonne. La Rose to Golden Meadow Hurricane Protection System, they didn't flood in Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Rita, Hurricane Isaac. They didn't file a claim. And yet their system is decertified. This is a flawed and broken system. It's the reason CBO says there's no score to this, because the way it's being implemented is unworkable, and even FEMA's admitting this isn't ready for prime time. So this amendment is needed to say, let's go back and actually make a system that works. Fix the problems with the system, but you don't go and you punish the people that played by all the rules and never even filed a claim. So I support the amendment, urge my colleagues to do so as well, and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. What purpose, gentleman from Mississippi, rise?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise today to ask my colleagues to support this bipartisan amendment to the Homeland Security Appropriations Act. And I want to thank Representative Cassidy, Representative Waters, Scalise Richmond, and the many others who support this amendment. This amendment would provide relief for many homeowners across the nation facing significant increases in their flood insurance premiums because of the Biggert Waters Flood Insurance Reform Act of 2012. Many facing these steep increases are still recovering from devastating storms in recent years, such as Hurricane Katrina, Isaac, and Sandy, and some could see increases as steep as 25% per year. While I believe it is imperative that the NFIP program remains solvent so that flood insurance remains available to those who need it the most, changes can be implemented in a more compassionate and gradual way. The severe way in which these rates are increased under current law will place a heavy financial strain on families, small businesses, and new home buyers. The fact is, we need more time to study how these rate changes will affect Americans. This amendment to the Homeland Security Appropriations Bill gives FEMA more time to complete an affordability study and to review the impact that these rate increases would have on homeowners. It keeps NFIP solvent in the long run while implementing changes in a compassionate manner that keeps flood insurance both affordable and available. I strongly urge my colleagues to support this amendment. And I yield my time to Representative Cassidy.
I thank you for yielding that time.
The gentleman from Mississippi has to remain on his feet.
I thank you for yielding the time, and I'll be very short. Let me say to my colleagues who oppose this bill that this does not repeal the entire law. This just repeals that portion which is not actuarially sound. We did vote for an insurance program, but we voted for one that was functional and, again, actuarially sound. Now, make it clear, this does not repeal Section 205. Those that built below code or in flood zones knowingly violating local code will still pay the penalty. This is for 207 for folks who have never flooded, who've done it right, who've built behind flood protection to code, and yet in some cases, because of actuarially flawed methodology, they will be paying up to $20,000. Now, by the way, I did vote for this bill, but not to force an inaccurate, dysfunctional system, which the GAO has criticized, upon homeowners that are trying to live their life. There should be sanity and fairness, but that sanity and fairness should be addressed to having something which is actuarially sound. Now, one of my colleagues said, wait a second, some will pay less and some will pay more. Actually, some may pay less, next year pay more, and then pay less again because they're being judged by systems which, again, are not sound. We speak so often in here of bringing certainty to business. Let's allow business to know what's going on. Why not have that same principle with homeowners? Let's get the actuarial process in which we judge their risk sound. Then we can tell them their premium is high, their premium is low. Right now we're telling them it's going to fluctuate up and down because the method by which we judge them is so poorly designed. So I do urge passage of this amendment, both for the sake of proving we can have functional government, as well as for the sake of these homeowners who are going to be terribly affected if we do not do so. I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
The gentleman from Mississippi yield back his time.
I yield back.
What purpose does the gentleman from Georgia rise? The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I yield my time to the gentleman from Georgia.
Gentleman from Georgia has to remain on his seat.
I don't think I'll take the whole 5 minutes, but I do appreciate the gentleman yielding. FEMA has already stated that their staff in Louisiana were wrong to provide these estimates based on inaccurate and incomplete information. They've already said that. In reality, no one knows, not FEMA, not any of my colleagues, how much folks in these flood zones will pay for premiums under Section 207. It's still being evaluated. Flood maps change after every flood, and they're going to continue to do it because of development and more impervious surface and other things that cause flooding to create in different areas. There is an appeal process that you can go through, but the best place to do this is where it originated, in the Financial Services Committee, not as an amendment on an appropriations bill. How many hearings have been held on this amendment? None. We're always talking about regular order. That's our cry, regular order. Why don't we go through the regular process, go through the same committee that this bill originated out of, and see if there's not some oversight that we can offer to FEMA to make sure that these people are not hit with these high premiums and that everybody gets on the same page and we understand that if these improvements have been made by cities and counties or homeowners, that they need to be taken into consideration. But this is not the way to do it. And we talk about unintended consequences. I think this bill was 75 pages long. I can read Section 207 if you want me to, but it's pretty plain in what it says. There's no unintended consequences to this. This is exactly what it said. Now, if you want to talk about revisiting unintended consequences, let's look at the 2,800-page Affordable Care Act. We can look at some unintended consequences then. But this is plain and simple. This isn't asking to create another agency, a board, a commission. This is trying to make FEMA and the Corps do their job on this mapping. This is the wrong place, it's the wrong time, it's the wrong bill to do this. I would work in a joint effort with these people to try to bring some resolution to this problem. But you've got to remember that these fees do not come into effect this year. And nobody knows what they're going to be. So the Congress is either at stop or knee-jerk reaction. And this is something that needs to be carefully thought out. It needs to go through the subcommittee, the committee process, and the chairman has promised that he is going to review this and look at the implementation of it. So why not let's give the system, if we believe in regular order, let's give the system time to work and let's put it in the committee where the work was originally done. With that, I just hope that it'll be a no vote on this, that it can go back to the committee, that and Ms. Waters and others have put in a bill. Let's go back, let's review it, let's look at it, let's bring FEMA in, and let's do some oversight, which is our responsibility in the Financial Services Committee, not the Appropriations Committee. Now yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I speak in favor of the amendment, and I yield to my colleague, the gentleman from Louisiana.
Gentleman from Florida has to remain on his seat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've heard talk about if we believe in regular order. Some of us believe in regular order, most of us believe in regular order, but I think everybody in this body believes in home ownership. And the fact that it's your biggest, safest investment, you pass it down generation to generation. And those people who work, sacrifice, save money to buy a home, that we ought not change the rules in the middle of the game with a system that's dysfunctional. It doesn't work, but at the same time, we say that we value the sanctity of home ownership and the American dream. So what we're asking here today is that we just back up a little bit, because part of what leadership does is that sometimes you make a decision that has consequences that weren't foreseen or that are not ready to be implemented. But the true sign of leadership is that you back up and say, let's get it right. not let's do it just for the sake of doing it because we were already going down that road. Well, it's the wrong road. And the biggest question is, what message are we going to send to those people in New York, Louisiana, and all of those red dots on the state, on the map that Representative Cassidy had? What message are we sending to them? Yes, you saved to buy a home. Yes, you pay your insurance. But now we're going to raise your insurance so high you can't afford that home anymore. What are they to do? Walk away from the home? Now it's on the banks. Now it's on the community. We have more blighted property. That's not what we should do as a body, representing the people, representing our constituents. And I would just say that it's not wrong, it's not unusual, and it's a strong sign of leadership to say, hey, we may have gotten this one wrong. Let's review it, let's make sure we're being fair, and let's make sure that we protect the American dream as Congress people. So that's all I'm asking. With that, Mr. Chairman, I would just re-urge my colleagues to support the amendment, and I would yield the balance of my time back to my friend.
I reclaim my time, and I yield the remainder of my time to the gentlelady from California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The gentleman from Georgia talked about there are no unintended consequences, and he attempted to speak for me, one of the authors of the bill. And I just think that he does not understand that we put in a lot of work on this bill. We worked in a bipartisan way. And if one of the authors of the bill tells you there are unintended consequences, then I think the gentleman from Georgia cannot dispute that. And let me just say that I talked with FEMA about mapping, and I talked with FEMA about these decertified levees, and they admitted that they had decertified some and they're going to recertify them because they didn't quite know what they were doing. They also told me that the maps certainly need a lot of work, that they are not complete. And what I'm saying is this: all of those homeowners who can't sleep at night, who can't plan their futures, don't know whether or not they're going to be able to send their children to college, all of those homeowners who are in limbo, who don't understand whether or not they're going to be able, certainly they're not going to be able to pay increased premiums, but won't be able to sell the house, why would we be a party to causing that kind of consternation to fellow human beings? I don't think we want to do that. We have the power here today to support Mr. Cassidy's bill and to buy some time and tell FEMA to get it right, to work on it, because these are unintended consequences. And so I just wanted the gentleman from Georgia to know that I certainly appreciate your concern, but you certainly don't understand the work that was put into it and how I know unintended consequences when I see them because of the way that I worked on the bill, and I know it was not intended to do what it is now doing. And if you had spent some time with the people who traveled to Washington, D.C., elected officials and community leaders alike, who took up a whole room making an appeal to us to not put them in a position where they would lose their homes, where communities would be destroyed because FEMA was not ready, not prepared, not equipped maybe to do what they needed to do to carry out the bill even, and that some of those increases that were being talked about, that were being projected, were increases that were almost made up. They were not actuarially sound. And so I would ask you to please vote for this bill, change your mind, give some leadership, and ask your colleagues to vote for the bill.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. Time of the gentleman has expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Cassidy. As many as are in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. No. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Louisiana will be postponed. What purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word for the purpose of entering into a colloquy with the esteemed Chairman of the Homeland and Security Appropriations Subcommittee to discuss a matter of importance to our nation.
The United States Army is electing to reduce the number of Lakota light utility helicopters, which are made in my congressional district, that they had intended to purchase over the next 2 fiscal years. These helicopters are cheaper to acquire, maintain, and operate than other rotary wing aircraft which the Army has recently contracted for. I respect the Army's wishes to control costs and not purchase additional aircraft that they do not need, but I am hopeful that you, Mr. Chairman, and the Chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, Texan Michael McCall, will work with me to have a study conducted to see if there is not some way to enhance our Homeland Security through a cost-effective manner by which utilizing Lakota helicopters in operations that could protect the American people and secure our borders. I yield to the Chairman.
I thank the Chairman for yielding, and I want to say that I'll be happy to work with you, Mr. Martin, in this as we move forward in the appropriations process, and I'll yield back to my friend.
I want to thank the Chairman for his willingness to work with me. Before I yield back, I just want to let the country know that when Texas is working, we get our job done a lot quicker than when Louisiana is arguing. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Illinois rise?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Ms. Bustos of Illinois. At the end of the bill, before the short title, add the following new section. None of the funds made available by this act may be used to enter into a contract with an offerer for the purchase of an American flag if, as required by the Federal Acquisition Regulation, the flag is certified as a foreign end product.
The gentlelady from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The purpose of this amendment is simple. It would ensure that American flags purchased with funds from this bill are actually made in America. Pretty simple, straightforward, common sense. Currently, here's what's happening. The Department of Defense, the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Department of Homeland Security, and even the U.S. Capitol are free to buy American flags that are only 50% made in the United States of America. I find this astonishing. There are companies in America that manufacture American flags. Pretty logical. And there have been legislative efforts in the past to make sure that American flags purchased by the federal government are actually made in America. Last Congress, Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio was able to secure passage of the All-American Flag Act through the U.S. Senate by unanimous consent. Unfortunately, the House was unable to consider the measure prior to adjourning the last session of Congress. According to the most recent, according to the most recent numbers from the U.S. Census, the value of American flags imported to the United States last year alone was $3.8 million. $3.6 million of worth came from China alone. A Made in China tag should never be sewn into an American flag, let alone American flags purchased by our federal government. My amendment today is an attempt to address the growing practice of importing American flags not actually made in America. The idea for this came about just last week when I was home listening to veterans all over our district. I was in Rockford, Peoria, the Quad Cities, Galesburg, Illinois. Listened to veterans from the Gulf War, from the Vietnam War, from World War II, and had gentlemen stand up so disheartened by the fact that they had flown flags, they had seen flags that had a Made in China tag sewn into it. So it is my hope that this Congress will engage further on this issue. But until that time, I feel it necessary to offer this amendment. We must send a clear message as to what our expectations are. And with that in mind, and using existing law as guide, this amendment would ban purchases of any flag declared as a foreign end product in Buy American Act certifications required by all federal contracts. This amendment is just the first step in what I hope is a larger effort to require that all American flags purchased by the federal government are actually made in America. I hope my colleagues here today will support me in this endeavor and work with me in moving forward on future similar efforts. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back her time. The gentleman from Texas.
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, we will support the lady's amendment, and I'll be happy to yield to my colleague, Mr. Price, so that he can also support this amendment.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I'm happy to urge colleagues to vote for the amendment. Yield back.
Yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from Illinois. As many as are in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. What purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina rise?
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Meadows of North Carolina. At the end of the bill, before the short title, add the following section. None of the funds made available by this act may be used for entering into a new contract for the purposes of purchasing ammunition before the date the report required by Section 567A is submitted to Congress.
The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a simple amendment which will ensure the Department of Homeland Security is being accountable to Congress and, more importantly, the American people. Earlier this year, it was reported that DHS solicited bids for some 1.1 billion rounds of ammunition. This was more than 10 times the amount that the Department purchased in fiscal year 2012. Given this large purchase, the American people and members of Congress rightfully had concerns and questions. The Appropriations Committee has recognized these concerns, and by including language in this bill to address the ammunition purchased by requiring DHS to report the cost and the need to Congress. This initial report is required to be submitted at the time of the President's budget. I commend the Appropriations Committee for their work in this area, and my amendment would complement their efforts and prohibit any new purchases of ammunition until the required report is submitted to Congress. It does not prevent existing contracts for procurement from being carried out. This is a responsible amendment which ensures that Congress and the American people are aware of the necessity and the cost of ammunition prior to entering into new contracts for procurement. On April 15, 2013, DHS had an inventory of almost 250,000 rounds of ammunition. In fiscal year 2012, DHS purchased 178,200 rounds. This is less than half the inventory that they have on hand. And as of February 22, 2013, there were 62,618 employees at DHS trained and certified in firearms. Given our current inventory, each individual has nearly 4,000 rounds before our inventory would be exhausted. With these facts in mind, it is important that we are responsible in entering into contracts for ammunition purchases. My amendment will ensure that this is the case. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your time, and I urge support. I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
I rise in opposition to the gentleman's amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
And I'd like to say to my colleague, I'm on the same wavelength with him. And I have had both my personal office and my staff here at the committee look into in detail the allegations that he has raised by his amendment. And he is quite accurate that the amount of ammunition that is presently seems to be in the hands of DHS and the amount of purchases that have taken place over the last 3 years, from a gun owner standpoint, if you take a hard look at it, looks like they're shooting an awful lot of rounds in practice. And I have the same concerns that he has about that. That's why I put into this bill, and at my request, this review of the training exercises, how many rounds are issued for training, how many rounds are issued for firing in harm's way, and a complete report to the Congress of the United States on this issue, because the American people are very concerned about this issue. And I will assure my colleague we're going to look at this report in detail. we're going to have hearings and discuss with the members of DHS and all the gun-toting DHS folks to get an accurate assessment of how much shooting they do and how much they need to shoot. By my own personal inquiry, by talking to ICE last Friday, in addition, I've talked to the Border Patrol personally, and they shoot 4 times a year to qualify, and quite honestly, they acknowledge that they don't need to shoot, they don't need that as many rounds as people think they do. But we want to get this study done, and if we can have patience to do the study and not try to restrict contracting until we know, and then I honestly am not encouraged to allow DHS to have huge stockpiles of ammunition around the country. We want to have an efficient utilization of the purchasing power. As to the contracting power that they have for that billion-plus rounds, that's a process that I learned through my questions that is used to keep the lowest possible price, and there's no intent to make that. I will in just a moment. There's no intent to make that type of purchase by DHS in any form or fashion. It's a way that contracting is done on ammunition to utilize. I will also say utilize the cheapest price. I will also say, and then I'll yield, we checked with every ammunition manufacturer in the country, and they assured me that the shortage of ammunition on the shelves for the American hunter and shooter is not because of purchases by DHS or the military or anybody else. Quite honestly, it's because the American people are buying rounds as fast as they come on the shelf, and they're competing with their fellow Americans. I'll be glad to yield to my friend.
I appreciate the chairman yielding, and I appreciate his comments. This amendment would not stop the current bids that are out there, the current process that we have in place. It would just stop additional process. We're looking at some 6 months before this report would be due, and the inventory that we have in place currently, the inventory, Mr. Chairman, that we have in place currently is more than enough to handle the target requirements, the requirements that we have currently for those. We've had hearings already in a number of committees that have addressed that, and the background that we have and the inventory that we have is more than enough to handle this while we wait for this report. And with that, I yield back, and I thank you.
Reclaiming my time, I understand the gentleman's argument. I think it is in the best interest for us to go forward with this study. We are going to keep a close eye. That's why we got it in this bill on this issue, but I'm not prepared at this time to restrict contracting, so I have to oppose the amendment. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from North Carolina.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I simply want to express my agreement with the chairman on this matter. I appreciate the amendment being offered from my friend from North Carolina, but I believe it would introduce an element of rigidity, a kind of arbitrary element into the purchasing process. The chairman has looked into this very carefully. We have provisions in the bill that should get to the bottom of any allegations that have been made about the matter. But in the meantime, to kind of presuppose, it seems the amendment almost presupposes a negative or suspicious outcome of the study. Maybe not, but in any case, I see no reason for layering on a requirement forbidding the purchase of ammunition while we conduct this study. So I urge defeat of the amendment and yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from North Carolina. As many as are in favor will signify by saying aye. Those opposed will say no. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
I seek yeas and nays.
First, the gentleman asks for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from North Carolina will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise?
Mr. Chairman, I have 3 amendments at the desk. These are Grayson number 1, 3, and 4, and I ask unanimous consent in view of the late hour that they be considered en bloc.
Is there objection? Without objection, the amendments will be taken en bloc. The clerk will designate or report.
En bloc amendment consisting of amendments number 1, 3, and 4 offered by Mr. Grayson of Florida. At the end of the bill, before the short title, add the following new section. None of the funds made available by this act may be used to enter into a contract with any offeror or any of its principals if the offeror certifies as required by federal acquisition.
Mr. Chairman,
From Florida.
I ask unanimous consent that we move on to the reading of the next amendment.
Without objection, the first reading of the First Amendment is suspended. The clerk will report the Second Amendment.
At the end of the bill, before the short title, add the following new section. None of the funds made available by this act may be used in contravention of the First, Second, or Fourth Amendments to the Constitution of the United States. At the end of the bill, before the short title, add the following new section. None of the funds made available by this act may be used for the purchase, operation, or maintenance of armed, unmanned aerial vehicles.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 5 minutes on his en bloc amendments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. With regard to the First Amendment, this amendment is identical to language that was inserted in the Military Construction VA bill yesterday by a voice vote. It expands the list of parties with whom the Department of Homeland Security and other relevant entities are prohibited from contracting with. And this includes contractors who have been convicted of fraud, theft, forgery, bribery, et cetera, according to the terms of the amendment and otherwise. With regard to Grayson number 3, the next amendment, this amendment is a simple one. It reads, none of the funds made available by this act may be used in contravention of the First, Second, or Fourth Amendments to the Constitution of the United States. As you'll notice, the same sentiment and the relevant language appears in my colleague Mr. Ellison's amendment addressing racial discrimination and other matters, and I gladly support his effort, which passed unanimously by voice last Congress, and hope the same will be possible of my amendment in this Congress. With regard to the last amendment, the last Grayson amendment, I regret that my colleague, Representative Holt, could not be here to offer this amendment himself. He is in New Jersey today remembering Senator Lautenberg. The amendment that I've called up is actually the Holt-Grayson amendment, the last amendment. It's an amendment that Mr. Holt attached to the bill in the last Congress as an en bloc amendment offered by Representative Adderholt that passed unanimously. The text of the amendment is the same word for word, and it reads as follows. None of the funds made available by this act may be used for the purchase, operation, or maintenance of armed, unmanned aerial vehicles. This is an important amendment and one that I'm proud to offer here today on behalf of Representative Holt. In no instance should DHS have access to or use weaponized drones. The bill before us today is the appropriations bill for the Department of Homeland Security, not the Department of Defense. That appropriations bill will come to the floor later this month, we hope. As our wars abroad come to a close and excess militarized drones become available for purchase and use, potentially by DHS, I feel it's important to lay down this marker here today that says, no, DHS may not have access to that military equipment. DHS will continue to have access to surveillance drones, and if the committee report is correct, DHS will increase their supply of drones and possibly even build a new airfield to support them. Congressman Holt shared his thoughts on the ways in which these drones should not be used in his previous amendment, so I'll close with this. Chairman Carter, Ranking Member Price, let's be clear with DHS, no armed drones in the United States. I ask for support of this amendment, and I yield the remainder of my time.
The gentleman yields back his time. For what purpose the gentleman from Texas rise?
Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
This en banc 3 amendments that we've got here, I'm going to address them as they were raised. One, in the First Amendment, I support this amendment with reservations that I don't understand some of the language in Section B, but I'm not here today to act as a judicial interpretation of this, which is already in law. But I have some questions about the civilly charged, but I'm not going to go into that, so I will accept that amendment. On the Second Amendment, concerning the 3 sections of the Constitution, I certainly will accept that, and in fact, I would not like for anything within this bill to be in controversy of any section of the United States Constitution. So I certainly have no problem with that. And thirdly, the Department has no intention to have armed drones and we will certainly accept the third amendment concerning armed drones. So I'm willing to accept all three and willing to yield to Mr. Price.
I thank the chairman for yielding and happy to also offer my support. Hope the colleagues will support this en bloc amendment. Yield back.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida en bloc. As many as are in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendments en bloc are agreed to. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise? The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I rise briefly to engage with the distinguished gentleman from Texas in a colloquy. First of all, I'd like to compliment Chairman Carter and Ranking Member Price and thank you for your work on this bill under some very difficult physical constraints. I believe the committee under your leadership has successfully found areas where taxpayers can really realize savings and implement reforms to strengthen our national security. As I've discussed with the chairman and other colleagues in the past, I'm a strong believer in the effectiveness of modeling and simulation for training. In the past, the Department of Homeland Security has purchased large quantities of costly live ammunition. Live fire testing and training is expensive, it's detrimental to the environment, and it's really unnecessary for most training of almost all DHS personnel. I believe that the Department of Homeland Security would be well served by increasing its efforts to better integrate and utilize modeling and simulation in the training of law enforcement and security personnel under their jurisdiction. For years now, our military and our armed forces, who daily face intense combat, in fact, they utilize effective and modern simulation technology in training and preparing our soldiers. These simulation technologies provide powerful planning and training tools capable of exposing all of our personnel to the complexities and uncertainties before ever stepping into harm's way. There's no reason DHS can't do the same thing. The use of simulation training has yielded better trained, more capable, and more confident personnel, again without live ammunition. Unfortunately, DHS just doesn't get it. Simulation training is a cost-effective means by which law enforcement and security personnel can improve readiness, tactical decision-making skills, ultimately save lives and save millions of dollars in taxpayer money. I yield to the chairman for comment.
Chairman Micah makes very, and I thank the gentleman for yielding. Chairman Micah makes very good points. FLETC and DHS should review their training regimen and determine where simulation equipment makes sense. I appreciate the gentleman bringing this opportunity to my attention, and I look forward to working with him on this
And
issue.
I look forward to working with the chairman to yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you.
The gentleman yields back his time. Who seeks time? For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment number 2 at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Murphy of Florida. At the end of the bill, before the short title, add the following new section. Section 571. None of the funds made...
Move that the reading be suspended, please.
Is there objection? Without objection, the reading will be suspended. The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise today to offer an amendment to the Department of Homeland Security Appropriations Act that would cut over $300 million from a program that is supposed to cost taxpayers nothing. If you, like me, are wondering how we got to this point of paying for a cost-free program, keep listening. Customs and Border Protection, along with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, conduct agricultural quarantine inspections on incoming vessels and passengers. This is an essential service that protects our nation's agriculture and wildlife. CBP and USDA have claimed that the cost of this program is covered by imposing fees on incoming vessels and travelers, a sensible approach. However, when the Government Accountability Office last examined the program in 2011, the fees covered only 60% of the program's cost. As a result, the taxpayers had to cover a $325 million shortfall. I recently introduced the Bipartisan SAVE Act with the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Joyce, which would implement recommendations by the GAO to push Customs and Border Patrol along with the USDA to adjust its fee structure and administration to fully cover the cost of this program. My amendment would prevent Customs and Border Protection from continuing to use taxpayer dollars to subsidize incoming vessels and travelers and make the program truly fee-supported. My amendment would free up remaining CBP funds to do what they should be doing, securing the homeland and facilitating travel, tourism, and trade. More tourism and more trade mean more American jobs. Mr. Chair, I think we can all agree that this is a common-sense amendment that saves taxpayers dollars and improves the environment for greater job growth. I urge my colleagues on both sides to support this cost-saving amendment. I yield the balance of my time.
Yields back. For purposes, the gentleman from Texas rise.
I rise in opposition to the gentleman's amendment.
Gentleman is recognized.
I oppose this amendment because it would make it impossible for CBP to carry out its mandated mission to inspect and clear agricultural products that enter the United States from a foreign country. A mixture of fees and discretionary funds pay for CBP officers that inspect and clear foreign ag products. When fees run out, discretionary funds pay for the officers' work. If we do not provide these funds, as the amendment proposes, agricultural imports to the United States would effectively halt trade. Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to vote against this amendment, and I'll recognize my colleague, Mr. Price.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the chairman yielding, and I also want to oppose this amendment, although I want to say to my colleague that I very clearly understand the purpose of this amendment. I think it's a worthy purpose. I think we should pay for these inspections through fee revenue, and the fees need to be adequate to the task. And so the gentleman, as I understand it, is trying to apply some pressure in that situation so that that gets done. That's a worthy purpose. But the risk is simply too great with a blanket prohibition of discretionary funds to be used for inspections. The risk is simply too great that the inspections, vital inspections that really can't lapse, would not go on. So I have to reluctantly urge defeat of the amendment, although I agree with and understand its underlying purpose. I yield back.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. You don't want to vote. What purpose does the gentleman from Georgia rise?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, printed in the congressional record, offered by Mr. Collins of Georgia.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I offer this amendment to ensure that none of the funds of this bill may be used in violation of Section 236C of the Immigration and Nationality Act. This amendment prohibits the United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement from using taxpayer dollars to process the release of or to administer alternate forms of detention to illegal immigrants who committed a crime which mandates their incarceration under Section 236C of the Immigration and Nationality Act. Section 236C requires the federal government to detain illegal aliens who committed any one of the serious crimes detailed in that section until that illegal alien is deported to their home country. In my home state of Georgia, ICE has processed the release of criminal aliens under the guise of sequestration. Along with the fellow members of the Georgia delegation, I have written to DHS and ICE on 2 separate occasions requesting more information about the releases. To date, DHS and ICE have failed to provide basic information regarding the criminal aliens released in Georgia. We don't know how many criminal aliens were released and to where. We don't know what crimes they had committed prior to detention, and we don't know what forms of alternatives to detention ICE is using to ensure they don't commit additional crimes. Mr. Chairman, this is unacceptable. Our nation was founded on the rule of law, and I do not believe taxpayer dollars should ever be used to circumvent the law. I appreciate the men and women who work for ICE and have great respect for their work they do and the sacrifices they make. This amendment ensures that political agendas won't interfere with the need to protect innocent citizens from criminal illegal aliens. The federal government should enforce immigration laws, particularly Section 236C, that mandates the detention of dangerous criminal illegal aliens. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment to prohibit taxpayer funds from being used in violation of Section 236C, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes, the gentleman from Texas rise?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the Chair for recognizing me. Though in principle I believe there are times when alternatives to detention make sense, utilizing them to release convicted criminals is never appropriate. Therefore, I appreciate Congressman Collins calling attention to the importance of ICE maintaining a robust capability to detain and maintain custody of illegal aliens, especially those convicted of violent and serious crimes and felonies like drug trafficking, prostitution, and conspiracy. Included in this bill are no less than $2.8 billion for enforcement and removal operations, which include $148 million to fully support the statutory requirements to maintain at least 34,000 beds, which is critical if we are going to ensure that convicted criminals and repeat offenders do not endanger public safety. Therefore, I'm happy to accept the gentleman's amendment. I reiterate my appreciation for Congressman Collins for offering it. And as to the fact that he didn't get information from ICE or from the DHS, I've had the same experience, and I was just as upset as you are. So I do support the Congressman's amendment.
Gentleman yields back.
Yield back.
From where? For purposes, gentleman from Mississippi rise.
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
Another amendment is currently pending. It is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. For what purposes, gentleman from Mississippi rise?
Still have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 4, printed in the congressional record, offered by Mr. Thompson of Mississippi.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, my amendment does one simple thing. It stops TSA from continuing to waste taxpayers' dollars on a program the agency has not scientifically validated or shown to be cost-effective. Since 2007, TSA has spent approximately $1 billion on its behavioral detection program, the screening of passengers by observation techniques, commonly referred to as the SPOT program. Under this program, on an annual basis, TSA spends about $200 million to deploy 2,800 behavioral detection officers, or BDOs, at airports around the country to observe passenger behaviors for signs that they present a terrorism risk to aviation. While the goal of this program, preventing terrorists from boarding flights, is laudable, the program is by any measures fatally flawed. Chief among these flaws is that TSA has not scientifically validated that BDOs can identify terrorists by observing behaviors. Indeed, the Government Accountability Office has found that not any known or suspected terrorists have moved through screens on 23 different occasions in airports where BDOs were deployed. In fact, BDOs have never identified, apprehended, referred to law enforcement, or prevented a terrorist from boarding an aircraft. This is not surprising, considering that there is no scientific basis for suggesting that they should or would be able to do so. As if it were not bad enough that TSA has spent almost $1 billion on a program without scientific validation, yesterday the New York Times reported that the DHS Inspector General has found that TSA cannot ensure passengers at U.S. airports are screened objectively under the SPOT program. show that the program is cost-effective or reasonably justify the program's expansion. Indeed, the IG found that the program does not have a strategic plan, a financial plan, or even a comprehensive or uniform training program. In light of the sequester and the resulting budget cuts, I, for one, see no justification for spending another dollar on a program that is wasteful and ineffective. Mr. Chair, the time has come to stop TSA from squandering additional funds on this misguided effort. I was surprised that in these austere times, the Appropriations Committee provided funding for the program, especially when in the report accompanying H.R. 2217, the committee questioned the fundamentals for the program when it said that there are outstanding questions remaining over the value of the program. We have an opportunity today to ensure we fund programs that are merit-worthy and effective, not programs whose value and effectiveness have not been established. Further, we have the opportunity to ensure that $200 million saved by defunding this program are put to far better uses, such as expanding TSA's pre-check program so more individuals can receive expedited screening, reducing wait times at screening checkpoints, and bolstering surface transportation security. Earlier today, the chairman of the Appropriations Committee stated that we cannot afford to fund unproven and wasteful programs. I could not agree more. That is why I'm offering this amendment to cut off funding for TSA's unproven and wasteful spot program. With that, Mr. Chair, I urge my colleagues to support my amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. What purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
I rise in opposition to the gentleman's amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I share some of the concerns of the gentleman from Mississippi, and I believe that the outstanding question still remains over the actual value of the Behavioral Detection Officer BDO program, which has yet to be sufficiently validated by TSA. In addition, it's my understanding that a recent OIG report may validate